is ABC News Nightline. Reporting from Washington, Ted Koppel.
Good evening. We continue now with the extraordinary background story of the long series of attempts to negotiate the release of the American hostages from Iran. Many of you have already seen the first hour of that story. For those of you who are just joining us, however, Pierre Salinger resumes his narrative by bringing you up to date on the people involved and the roles that they played. Here again is my colleague, Pierre Salinger.
Thank you, Ted. The overthrow of the Shah of Iran by the Ayatollah Khomeini had been a serious blow to American foreign policy in the area of the Persian Gulf. But in the first months of the Islamic Revolution, it still seemed possible that the United States could reach an accommodation with the new rulers of Iran. The decision by the United States government to allow the former Shah of Iran to come to New York for an operation changed all that. From Iran, the Shah's arrival was perceived as the first step of an American plan to overthrow the Ayatollah Khomeini, and the Iranians reacted with anger. The trigger point came on November 4th, 1979, when a group of Islamic students stormed the American embassy in Tehran and took 66 American diplomats hostage. Sadek Ghazadeh, the former foreign minister of Iran, who was always opposed to the taking of the hostages, gives us an Iranian insight into the hostage-taking in an exclusive interview he gave to this broadcast.
Well, the concept of taking the hostages in the beginning was obviously a reaction to the American roles in the coup d'etat of 1953 and then later on their intervention in the internal affairs. And this reaction, if could have been understood by the American government and acted upon rather carefully, without any politics, I think could have been resolved, the problem could have been resolved rather soon.
But it was not resolved soon. The United States sought out anyone in the world who had contacts with the Iranians. That net turned up two persons who became central figures in the negotiations. One was a left-wing French lawyer, Christian Bourguet. Bourguet had been a friend of Iranian President Abul Hassan Bani Sadr and Ghazadeh, while the two Iranian leaders had been in exile in Paris. The other was an Argentinian businessman, Hector Villalon, who had also become an exile in Paris and had gotten to know Bani Sadr and Ghazadeh in the French capital. For more than a year, they would be central figures in the secret effort of the United States government to free the hostages. The man Bourguet and Villalon worked with was Hamilton Jordan, President Carter's top White House and campaign aide, who was thrust into the heart of the negotiations. Jordan, using an alias and carrying a false passport, frequently traveling on a U.S. Air Force jet, flew to a number of secret meetings in Europe and Panama with Bourguet and Villalon. Jordan's role in the negotiations came on the heels of the failure of the mission of UN Secretary General Kurt Waldheim to Tehran in the first days of January 1980. Waldheim had been asked by the United States government to present the Iranians with the following proposal. Waldheim would create a UN commission to look into the crimes of the Shah and America's involvement in the affairs of Iran. But he was to tell the Iranians that the commission would only be created after the American hostages were freed. But Waldheim had panicked in Tehran, particularly after a mob attacked him in the cemetery of the Iranian martyrs. An Iranian radio announced his life had been threatened. Instead of proposing a UN commission after the hostages were freed, Waldheim did the opposite. He told the Iranians he would form a commission before the hostages were freed. In an interview for this broadcast with ABC News UN correspondent Lou Chiaffi, Waldheim confirmed he changed the plan.
Mr. Secretary General, before you left Fort Tehran, it's reported that you had agreed with the United States, or the United States had agreed, that you would go there and offer a UN commission to the Iranians in exchange for the release of the hostages. And yet when you got there and you talked to the Revolutionary Council, the commission did not automatically mean the release of the hostages, but simply set a process in motion. What happened between?
That is correct. Of course, we had to set in motion a process. The commission, the inquiry commission, was a means to achieve the release of the hostages. We did recognize the grievances of the Iranian authorities, the Iranian people, on the one hand, but we also made clear that the American people and its government also have their grievances about the treatment of the hostages. So the purpose was to agree on the setting up of a UN inquiry commission, which would lead then to the release of the hostages.
We have told you how this failure of Kurt Waldheim became fully known to the American government. Bourget and Villalon flew to Washington from Tehran in late January, and at a meeting in the White House, gave Hamilton Jordan secret audio tapes which had been made of Waldheim's meeting with the Iranian Revolutionary Council. At Camp David, President Carter was briefed on the contents and learned the full extent to which Waldheim did not follow U.S. recommendations. But working from there, Bourget, Villalon, and Jordan fashioned a new plan. They called it a scenario for a UN commission that would bring about the freedom of the hostages. They almost succeeded. But in the end, the Ayatollah Khomeini stepped in and imposed conditions on the commission its members would not accept. The commission went home without having seen the hostages. Despite this failure, Gosbedeh has the highest praise for the work of the French lawyer Bourget and the Argentinian businessman Villalon as intermediaries, and concurs that they came close to getting the hostages released.
They were extremely honest because they didn't try to interfere in the affair. They tried to clarify the positions. They were acting actually in our behalf. Since we couldn't directly discuss the problem with the United States or any other one, in particular in relation to these problems, they discussed it in our behalf. And they did a very honest job.
Now we begin the other chapters of our story. A whole other aspect of the story involves how the Panamanian government, working in concert with the United States, connived to get the Shah of Iran arrested in Panama so the hostages could be released. We will start telling you that story in just a moment.
This ABC News special edition of Nightline, America Held Hostage, the secret negotiations will continue.
Who had held the fate of millions in the palm of his hand, that he could no longer control his own destiny. Living in exile on tiny Contador Island in Panama, the Shah became the increasing target of scheming and intrigue. The Iranians wanted him back. That had been their first condition for the release of the hostages. But Panamanian law made extradition of the Shah difficult, even impossible. Under Panamanian law, no person could be extradited to a country where the death penalty existed. The orgy of executions in Iran at the beginning of the revolution was a stark reminder that the death penalty did exist there. But Panamanian law also said that if a foreign country brought charges against one of its citizens with enough presumption of guilt, the Panamanian government had to arrest that person while the charges were studied. The American government never favored the idea of extraditing the Shah to Iran, but it came to accept the idea of the Shah being arrested if somehow this highly symbolic act for the Iranians could be translated into freedom for the American hostages. The Panamanians were willing to do what the Americans wanted, and if arresting the Shah was acceptable to the United States, they would arrest the Shah. With this background, it is easier to understand what happened in the 60 days which elapsed between January 23rd and March 23rd, 1980. Two important dates in the story of the American hostages as it was linked to the Shah and to Panama. We will recall that the French lawyer Christian Bourget and the Argentinian businessman Hector Villalon had flown off to Tehran on January 21st after their first meeting in London for 12 hours with Hamilton Jordan, the right-hand man of President Carter. Iranian Foreign Minister Sadek Gosbedeh was very excited with this new high-level American contact. Gosbedeh believed that through Jordan, he could get the Americans to pressure Panama into extraditing the Shah and bringing him back to Iran. At that time, Gosbedeh still firmly believed extradition of the Shah was possible. Also, such a spectacular coup would be of great help to Gosbedeh personally. He was a candidate for president of Iran. and his campaign was going badly. That overpowering need for a dramatic event to help his campaign is part of the explanation of the bizarre events which took place on January 23rd. That morning at 3:30, Christian Bourget received a call from an excited Gosbedé, who told him he had received an important call from Panamanian President Aristides Royo.
He had received a telephone call from the Panamanian president telling him that Panama had made a decision to arrest the Shah and that this was going to be announced in the morning and that they would confirm this by telex.
Bourget, who had planned an early flight to Paris that morning, rolled back over to sleep. A half hour later, 4 a.m., the phone rang again. It was Gosbedé who reported this time he had talked to the Panamanian leader, General Omar Torrijos.
I was a little sleepy, but he told me he had received a second telephone call from General Torrijos to tell him that the decision had been made to arrest the Shah.
Bourget cautioned Gosbedé to say nothing about the phone call until the telexes arrived.
I advised him to wait until he received the confirmation telex. He had apparently instructed that the announcement of the arrest not be given until the telex had been received. The telex was supposed to arrive at 7 o'clock, but there was a problem, because Gosbedé had understood 7 o'clock Tehran time, whereas President Royo was speaking of 7 o'clock Panamanian time.
The confusion stems from the fact that 7 a.m. Tehran time is not the same thing as 7 a.m. Panama time. There is, in fact, 8½ hours difference between the two. At the time, Foreign Minister Gosbedé realized an error had been made because of the difference in time.
He said he's going to announce the decision in the morning Panama time, which is going to be in the afternoon, our local time. Unfortunately here, they made a mistake to release the information beforehand. And obviously, what I'm sure has annoyed a certain number of officials in Panama was a premature announcement here.
Panamanian President Royo was indeed upset with Gosbedé's early morning announcement that the Shah had been arrested as the first step in the extradition proceedings. It was all a misunderstanding. After interviewing all of the principals, we can now tell you what really happened. Royo and Torrijos did call Gosbedé in the middle of the night. They told Gosbedé that Panama was going to announce that when the Iranians filed their extradition papers, the Shah would be arrested as required under Panamanian law. Panama gave Iran 60 days to get together the necessary documents. But because of bad telephone lines and a language problem, Gosbedé only got the message that the Shah was going to be arrested. He apparently did not hear or understand that the arrest would only come when the extradition papers were filed. The language barrier was significant. For example, General Torrijos does not speak English, and Gosbedé does not speak Spanish. While the incident was unfortunate, it did clarify for the Iranians just what they had to do to get the Shah arrested. And as the days went by, Gosbedé became increasingly convinced that the Panamanians would not extradite the Shah, but that they would arrest him with the proper documentation, something which would be highly symbolic in Iran and facilitate the negotiations for the release of the hostages. Back in Panama, there were important and daily civil disorders. The presence of the Shah had provoked an angry reaction among part of the Panamanian population. For the first time in 10 years, the National Guard was ordered to take repressive measures. General Torrijos was paying dearly for his friendship with President Carter, a friendship that led to Panama's invitation to the Shah. But for the former Iranian monarch, his sojourn in Panama was proving beneficial. His health had improved dramatically during the month of January. He had gained 24 pounds, and his doctors were pleased with his recovery from the New York operation. But then things went bad